He says 4 alphas have been waiting for you, that the carpool wasn't random, that Dante chose you. Rowan supported it. Kenji prepared it all. Yasuo was the reason your suppressants finally failed. Your entire world tilts. These men who've been caring for you, who've shown you what it means to be actually seen, they planned this from the beginning. Your heart is racing. Your emotions are spiraling between gratitude and the overwhelming question. Were they always going to take care of me, or did they just know I'd accept their help once I finally let my guard down? How did 4 alphas who barely knew me become the center of everything I am? And why can't you imagine your life without them? If you want to hear more of this Omegaverse romance, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for the full story. I should have known something was different. Should have paid attention to the fact that my suppressants were failing more often, that I was finding excuses to leave meetings just to breathe air that wasn't saturated with alpha pheromones. But I was too busy doing what I'd always done, surviving, showing up, making myself small enough that nobody noticed what I was. The problem was I'd started working from the downtown office 3 days a week, and the commute from my apartment in Queen Anne to Pioneer Square was exactly 37 minutes on a good day. I hated driving, hated the parking, hated the traffic, hated the way my hands shook on the steering wheel when I was tired. So when Dante from the 5th floor mentioned that 4 alphas from the strategic planning division were organizing a carpool, I'd done something unprecedented. I'd volunteered to join. Dante was the one who'd invited me. Sleek, put together, the kind of alpha who looked like he'd been born in a tailored suit. He'd stopped me in the break room while I was making tea that nobody had asked me to make, because that was the Omega equivalent of having a hobby. He'd said there's a carpool situation starting Monday, 4 of us, looking for a 5th for carpooling purposes, rotating schedule. You interested? And I'd said yes before my brain could catch up with my mouth, which was stupid, which was insane, which was probably the suppressant failure talking. Sitting in a enclosed vehicle with 4 alphas for nearly 40 minutes daily was the opposite of the safe, invisible existence I'd constructed. But something in me, some part that I kept in a locked box, had wanted it. Monday morning came with the speed of a biological disaster. I found the Tesla in the parking garage exactly where Dante had said it would be. Black, pristine. The kind of car that made statements about its owner. Dante was already in the driver's seat. Rowan was in the front passenger spot, massive and quiet. The kind of alpha who didn't need to speak because his size did the talking for him. Kenji was in the middle row, scrolling through something on his phone with a focus that suggested the rest of the world could burn and he wouldn't notice. And in the 3rd seat, as far from me as the vehicle would allow, was Yasuo. Yasuo was the problem. Not a problem exactly, but the reason I'd said yes to this carpool. I'd seen him in the hallway once, maybe twice, moving through the office with the kind of grace that didn't match his build. Broad shoulders, sharp features, eyes that seemed to catalog everything they looked at and immediately find it wanting. He was a strategist, which meant his brain worked differently than most people's. That he saw patterns where others saw chaos, and that he'd probably spent exactly no time noticing I existed. The first morning, I'd gotten in the back seat and Yasuo had acknowledged my presence with a nod so brief it could have been a muscle spasm. Then, he'd returned his attention to his laptop, and I'd spent 37 minutes staring at the back of his head while making small talk with Kenji, who turned out to be the kind of person who filled silence with actual conversation instead of the suffocating quiet I was used to. By Wednesday, the carpool had become the structural element of my week. Wake up, suppressant, shower, suppressant, clothes, suppressant, drive, to meeting point. Sit in back seat exactly 1 position away from Yasuo. Pretend not to notice the way he smelled like rain and coffee, and something underneath that made my Omega hindbrain sit up and pay attention. Endure 37 minutes of Kenji's running commentary about his weekend plans, Dante's calls to various people in his life, and Rowan's absolute silence punctuated by occasional grunts that seemed to satisfy him as full contributions to the conversation. The only constant was Yasuo's absolute disinterest. The man would have been interesting if he'd been hostile, but he wasn't. He was nothing, thoroughly, completely nothing, which somehow was worse than actively ignoring me. The suppressant protocol said that if I was experiencing breakthrough arousal, I needed to increase my dosage, talk to my doctor, potentially change medications. The suppressant protocol also said I was supposed to be taking them exactly as prescribed, not doubling up doses because I was nervous. But the suppressant protocol had been written by people who'd never had to exist in an office building full of people who could smell their weakness. By the following Monday, when week 2 of the carpool began, I was running on fumes and medication and the kind of denial that would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. My suppressants were failing more obviously now. I'd noticed Rowan's nostrils flare slightly when I got in the car. Kenji had stopped making jokes and started making concerned observations about whether I was feeling okay. Even Dante had gotten quieter, which for Dante meant he'd gone from actively social to merely existing in the same space. Only Yasuo hadn't changed. Still ignored me, still treated me like I was a piece of furniture that had somehow learned to talk. Still made my body respond with a heat that had nothing to do with the Seattle morning and everything to do with the specific configuration of his shoulders and the way his voice sounded when he answered Dante's questions about strategy and market positioning. Wednesday of week 2, I made a mistake. I miscalculated the timing on my suppressant dose and took it 4 hours early, which meant when I got in the carpool, the chemical barrier that had been holding was starting to break down right on schedule. I didn't realize until I was already seated, already locked in the vehicle with 4 alphas whose biology was designed to detect exactly the kind of weakness I'd been hiding. The scent hit first. Not my scent, though that was breaking through too. A kind of sweet, burnt sugar that I could smell myself now that the blockers were fading. But underneath my scent was something else. Something that had been present all along but that I'd been too chemically suppressed to register. 4 alphas. 4 distinct scent profiles. Dante's was sharp and professional, like expensive cologne that had been engineered in a laboratory. Rowan's was deep and woody, a scent that made you think of forests and things that lived outside civilization. Kenji's was warm and spiced, like cinnamon and something that might have been cardamom, making every breath feel like stepping into a cafe. And Yasuo's was the problem. Yasuo's scent was rain and coffee, and underneath it all something that made my Omega brain light up like a neon sign that said danger, attraction, mate, all the biological imperatives that I'd spent years learning to suppress into silence. The car pulled out of the parking garage and I realized with a sinking certainty that I'd made a catastrophic error. My suppressants were supposed to last until at least 8 p.m., but I'd taken them early, and they were peaking and fading right now, and I was trapped in a moving vehicle with 4 alphas who were beginning to notice that something had changed. Rowan's hand tightened on his coffee cup. Kenji turned to look at me with an expression of concern that shifted into something more complex when his nostrils flared slightly. Dante's phone call cut off abruptly, and Yasuo, who had spent 2 weeks being absolutely nothing to me, closed his laptop with a click that sounded deliberate and turned in his seat to look directly at me for the first time since I'd joined the carpool. He knows, I thought, with the clarity of absolute panic. He can smell that my suppressants are failing. He can smell what I am. The car was suddenly too small. 47 minutes suddenly felt like an impossible distance to travel. Dante was trying to restart his phone call with one hand while his other gripped the steering wheel. Rowan was looking out the window with the intensity of a man who was trying very hard not to look at something. Kenji was shooting me glances that had shifted from concern to understanding to something that looked a lot like sympathy. And Yasuo was still looking at me, still cataloging me with those dark eyes, and the energy in the car had gone from casual carpool to something electric and dangerous and weighted with implications I couldn't quite articulate because my brain was too busy short-circuiting. "I need to get out," I said, my voice coming out weaker than I wanted. "I don't feel well. Can you pull over?" Dante's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "We're on the highway, Aiden. It's not safe to pull over right now. 10 more minutes." "I can make 10 more minutes," Kenji said quietly, which was strange because Kenji didn't have the authority to promise anything about where this car went. But when I looked at him, he was looking at Yasuo, and there was something in that look that suggested a hierarchy in this carpool that I'd completely missed. Yasuo turned back to the window. His jaw was set. His hands were fists in his lap. The scent in the car had become so saturated with alpha that I could taste it on my tongue, could feel it coating my throat with every breath. My suppressants hit their final failure point at exactly mile marker 42. 1 second I was sitting in the backseat of a Tesla with my hands gripped together, trying not to embarrass myself, and the next second my body decided it had had enough of pretending. The heat started at the base of my spine and radiated outward in a wave so sudden and so complete that I made a sound I didn't know I was capable of making. Not a scream, more like the sound a body makes when it realizes it's falling. My skin went hot. Sweat broke out across my temples, and the slick started flowing so suddenly that I felt it through my pants in a rush that was humiliating and undeniable and absolutely impossible to hide. The car decelerated sharply. I heard Dante curse. Heard Rowan make a low sound in his chest that might have been a growl. Heard Kenji turn in his seat with urgency that suggested he was about to do something. And I felt Yasuo's entire body go rigid, every muscle locking as if someone had thrown a switch. The car pulled smoothly into the exit lane. Dante was driving by pure muscle memory, his eyes fixed on the road with a focus that suggested he was trying very hard not to pay attention to what was happening in the back seat. "Where?" Dante asked, speaking through what sounded like clenched teeth. "Where are we taking him?" Rowan's hand reached back without looking. He caught my wrist gently, and the touch of an alpha's skin against mine sent such a spike of heat through my body that I had to bite my lip to keep from making a sound. "The compound," Yasuo said quietly from the front seat. "It's closest." Nobody turned around to question this. Dante took the next turn with the precision of someone who'd driven this route 1,000 times. The Tesla accelerated. The landscape became less highway and more trees, and I realized with the kind of foggy understanding that my heat-addled brain was capable of that we were heading somewhere private. The compound. An alpha compound, which meant a place where multiple alphas lived together, which meant a place where an omega in heat would be taken care of, which meant this morning had just irrevocably changed my life in ways I didn't have the cognitive capacity to process right now. I can't think. My scent was pouring off me in waves. The sweet burnt sugar had become something richer, more complex, layered with the unmistakable chemical call of an omega asking for help. Every breath I took made the situation worse because more scent meant more alpha response, meant more pheromones in the air feeding into my own biological cascade. "I'm so hot," I gasped. "My clothes are too hot. Everything is too hot." "You're going into heat," Rowan said quietly, his voice layered with something that might have been concern or might have been hunger or might have been both at once. "It's okay. You're safe. We've got you." But the problem was I wasn't safe. And I wasn't sure I wanted to be, because some part of me had been waiting for this moment since the first day I'd gotten in this car and smelled Yasuo's rain and coffee profile and decided that my carefully constructed life of suppressants and invisibility was no longer worth the effort of maintaining. The compound revealed itself through the trees suddenly, a property that was clearly designed for privacy, set back from the road, surrounded by the kind of forest that didn't care about the city sprawling on the other side of it. The house was large in the way that alpha residences often were, all lines and angles and the kind of architecture that suggested serious money and serious intention. Dante pulled the car into the garage and killed the engine. The sudden silence was shocking. Only 4 alphas breathing heavily and 1 omega who could barely remember how to do it, all trapped in the enclosed space of a vehicle that suddenly felt smaller than a coffin. Kenji turned in his seat. His voice was gentle, but his eyes were sharp. "You've never presented to an alpha before, have you?" I shook my head. Never been in an actual heat cycle without medication to stop it. "This is my first time." The expression that crossed his face was complicated. A kind of tenderness mixed with something protective. "You couldn't have known this would happen," he said. "Heat doesn't work on a schedule, especially not the first time, especially not when." He trailed off, but his eyes flicked to Yasuo. And I understood suddenly that Yasuo was the reason my body had decided that today was the day. That Yasuo's scent, that rain and coffee profile, had somehow activated biological pathways that no suppressant was ever going to be able to keep closed. "We need to get him inside," Dante said, and there was a rawness to his voice that suggested he was running on the edge of control. "Before this escalates, before all of us start feeling it." "Already started," Rowan admitted quietly. "Can you smell it?" "I can taste it." Yasuo still hadn't moved, was still looking out the window at the garage wall with the intensity of a man who was having a very specific internal argument. His hands were still fists, the muscles in his neck were still locked. His scent had gone sharp enough to cut. I was lifted before I fully registered that it was happening. Rowan's arms, large and strong, wrapping around me, and my body responding by pressing against the contact with an urgency that was equal parts relief and desperation. The walk into the house was a blur of sensations. Cool air, the weight of Rowan carrying me, the progression of spaces that suggested a home designed by people who'd thought carefully about privacy and distance and the kind of infrastructure that made sense for alpha cohabitation. A staircase, a hallway, and finally, a room that smelled like 4 alphas sleeping in close proximity, which meant I'd been taken to their shared space. The bed was large. The kind of bed designed for bodies that needed to be close, that didn't believe in the kind of distance that normal beds implied. Rowan set me down gently on the comforter. His hands lingered. I could feel him warring with himself. The biological pull to respond to my heat slamming up against whatever control he'd spent years developing. "You need to hydrate," Kenji said, appearing with a water bottle that he placed on the nightstand. "And you need to decide what you want before this gets more complicated. Before Yasuo decides for you." My eyes found his, and Kenji's expression was serious and kind and completely without judgment. "What do you mean?" I managed, though my voice came out fractured because every nerve in my body was screaming for something I didn't have the language for. "I mean that Yasuo came into this carpool 2 weeks ago specifically because Dante mentioned there was an Omega joining. I mean that 4 alphas don't agree to a carpool for convenience. I mean that your scent hit this car and Yasuo stopped pretending to not care about you. I mean that we need to know if you want this or if we need to call someone. If you need help that we can't provide without making this complicated." My brain was too full of heat and pheromone and biological imperatives to process the full implications of what Kenji was saying. What I understood was that the carpool had been designed, that Yasuo had known I was going to be there, that 4 alphas had been waiting for my suppressants to fail in a car where I couldn't escape, which should have felt like a violation and which instead felt like coming home. I started, and then stopped, because I didn't have words for what I wanted. I wanted to not be terrified. I wanted to trust that this was safe. I wanted Yasuo to look at me the way he was looking at me right now, which was like I'd finally become visible, like I'd finally become real. "I want to stay," I whispered. "Please, I want to stay." Rowan closed his eyes. Kenji nodded once. Dante stepped out of the room, presumably to do something that involved giving space, or calling someone, or making some kind of decision. And Yasuo, who had remained motionless since we arrived, stood and walked toward me with the kind of precision that suggested he was operating on pure focus and will. His scent washed over me, rain and coffee, and now something wild underneath that told me his control was fracturing the way mine had already shattered. He knelt beside the bed. His hand found my face with the gentleness that nobody would have believed he was capable of if they'd only known him from the office. His fingers traced my cheekbone, my jaw, the line of my neck where my scent gland was pulsing with every heartbeat. "You were supposed to surprise us over weeks," he said quietly. "But your body had other plans. I don't understand." My voice came out very small. "Dante recruited you for a reason. Rowan agreed for a reason. Kenji recommended the carpool for a reason. But Yasuo's hand moved to my hair, gentle, his thumb tracing my temple. "I was supposed to learn to know you first, to show you that I was worth trusting, to let you decide without the complication of biology getting in the way. But your suppressants are new, and my scent is apparently your trigger, and now we're here, and you're asking to stay, and I'm trying very hard not to do something we can't take back." "Don't try," I breathed, and watched his pupils dilate fully, and felt the exact moment that his control snapped clean. Yasuo leaned forward and pressed his forehead against mine. I could feel him shaking, could smell the rain and coffee heightening into something that smelled like desire and restraint at war. His hand stayed in my hair, gentle even though everything about him was suddenly screaming alpha in the presence of heat. "This is your only chance to change your mind," he said roughly. "Once I touch you, once I get close enough to really feel your scent, I'm not going to be able to stop." My heat was answering the call of an alpha's restraint fracturing, which meant my body was getting wetter, was producing slick in quantities that I could feel soaking through my pants, was making sounds that I couldn't control. "I don't want to change my mind. I want you to touch me. I want to not be scared anymore. I want to let go." His eyes went completely black. The human parts dissolved, and what was left was pure alpha, pure instinct, pure want that had been waiting 2 weeks for permission. His mouth found mine, and the kiss was everything I'd never been allowed to want. Gentle enough that I could understand he was trying to be careful, rough enough that I could feel the enormous effort it was taking not to lose control completely. His hand was in my hair, the other bracing against the mattress to support his weight so he wouldn't crush me, and he was kissing me like he'd been waiting his entire life for my specific taste. I kissed him back and felt my body relax in a way that I'd never experienced before, the part of me that had been terrified since the day I realized what I was, finally settling into something that felt right. When he pulled away, both of us were breathing hard. His forehead was still against mine. His scent was pouring off him in waves that were making my heat response deepen into something almost frantic. "Your heat," he said quietly. will last 3 days at minimum, possibly 4, and all 4 of us are going to need to be present. The question is whether you're comfortable with that, or whether you need me to step back and let one of the others take the primary role. I processed this slowly, understanding that what he was asking was whether I was comfortable with being taken care of by all 4 of them, or whether I needed to choose one. Whether I needed to let go of the fantasy I'd apparently been building for 2 weeks and pick just one alpha to trust with my body and my heat. The answer came to me with absolute clarity. I want all of you, I said simply. I trust all of you. I came into this car to be near you, but I didn't know you yet. I know all 4 of you now. You came to the break room to invite me. Rowan understood something before I did. Kenji recommended this carpool for a reason, and Dante brought me here. I'm not choosing. I'm keeping. Yasuo's expression shifted, changed, became something so raw and vulnerable that I understood suddenly that he'd been terrified I'd turn him down. That 4 alphas had planned this, had engineered this, had brought me into this car for a reason, and he'd been the one who'd wanted me most, and he'd thought that maybe he'd miscalculated, that maybe the moment my suppressants failed, I'd panic and bolt. But I was staying. I was asking for all of them. I was presenting the kind of trust that alphas built entire lives around. He kissed me again, harder this time, less controlled, and I felt the exact moment that Rowan moved to the other side of the bed, understood that the first round of heat management was about to begin, and I was terrified and thrilled and so entirely certain of this choice that when Yasuo pulled back and asked one more time if I was sure, I didn't answer with words. I pulled him closer. Let the fear fall away, let the heat take over, and let 4 alphas show me that the carpool I'd joined 2 weeks ago wasn't about logistics at all. It was about 4 men who'd seen something in me worth protecting, worth waiting for, worth building an entire infrastructure around. The office would wonder why I didn't show up tomorrow. The commute would remain, unpacking its implications for days afterward. But tonight, in a bed that had apparently been waiting for me all along, I finally stopped being invisible. And in the moment where Yasuo's hands found skin, and Rowan's presence made everything feel safe, and Kenji whispered reassurances from the doorway, and Dante appeared with water and care, I understood with the clarity that only heat could bring. I hadn't joined a carpool. I'd come home. The first wave of heat lasted the entire first night. Time became non-linear, existing only in the space between heartbeats and the progressive deepening of intimacy that 4 alphas orchestrated with the kind of precision that suggested this wasn't their first time managing an Omega through the initial stages. Yasuo had been right about one thing. My heat was his trigger. But what he hadn't anticipated was that once my suppressants fell away entirely, my body would recognize something in all 4 of them that it craved. Rowan's steadiness became an anchor. Kenji's voice became a touchstone. Dante's presence became something that felt like protection. And Yasuo's touch became the center point around which everything else orbited. The physical intimacy stayed at a level that surprised me. There were touches, yes. Rowan's large hand on my lower back as I sat on the edge of the bed trying to find any position that wasn't actively uncomfortable. Yasuo's fingers tracing patterns on my arm that made my skin prickle with anticipation and need. Kenji pressing a cool cloth to my temples when the fever spiked. But it didn't escalate into the kind of explicit territory that I'd been half terrified and half excited about. Instead, it became clear very quickly that managing an Omega in heat was about more than just physical response. It was about temperature management, hydration, reassurance, the kind of care that made me understand that these 4 alphas had learned their role through something other than biology. That they'd studied this, prepared for this, built a response to heat that was as much about comfort as it was about anything else. By 2 a.m., I was wrapped in Rowan's arms while Yasuo sat beside the bed with his hand on my hair and Kenji continued to provide water and Dante had stepped out to do something with the house systems. The fever had plateaued. My slick production had gone into overdrive and stabilized into something my body could manage. And I was coming to understand that heat wasn't the immediate escalation into explicit territory that I'd been afraid of. It was complex, layered, full of moments where nothing was happening except 4 alphas keeping one Omega stable and safe and loved while his body worked through a cycle that had to run its course. Kenji was the one who explained it the next morning, when the immediate crisis had passed and I was lying in a nest of pillows and blankets that Rowan had constructed with surprising gentleness. Heat doesn't follow the same timeline for everyone, he said, bringing me breakfast that I ate mechanically while my body continued to produce heat pheromones on a loop. The media makes it seem like 3 days of non-stop explicit territory, but for most Omegas, it's waves. Hours of intense physical response followed by hours of relatively normal functioning. If you push too hard in the beginning, your body will fight back. Your cycle will extend. You'll suffer. The point is to work with it, not against it. But you four came prepared, I said, which was maybe not phrased as a question but sounded like one anyway. You planned this. Not the heat specifically, Kenji said, settling into the chair beside the bed, but we hoped. We wanted you to have the option to experience this in a safe place, with people who'd actually care about your comfort instead of treating it like a biological function to be exploited. That's all. The second day of heat was where things began to shift. My fever had stabilized into something manageable. My body had stopped fighting the presence of 4 alphas around me, and had instead started recognizing them as part of the solution to the continuous need that kept building in my core. Yasuo had stayed closest, and I'd stopped trying to pretend I didn't notice. His scent was woven into everything at this point, and my body had decided that his proximity was approximately as necessary as breathing. The touches had escalated slightly, not into explicit territory, but into territory that felt more loaded with intention. His hand on my knee, my hand in his hair. Moments where we both went very still because the reminder of what we weren't doing was almost as intense as the reminder of what we were. This is harder than I expected, Yasuo said quietly on the morning of the second day, when he thought the others weren't listening, which was probably false because Kenji had some kind of supernatural ability to hear conversations across rooms and Rowan seemed to have the kind of hearing that suggested military training, but he said it anyway, like he needed to tell me that his restraint was expensive. I know. My voice came out rough. I can feel it. My heat is centered on you, which means my body wants things from you specifically, which is making the restraint even harder than it would normally be. But Kenji says that pushing into explicit territory too early will extend the cycle, and I'd rather have you actually present for all 3 days than have you pass out from exhaustion on day 2. The understanding in his eyes when he looked at me at that statement was staggering. You trust that we'll take care of you, he said quietly, even though you know what I want to do. Even though you can smell how close I am to losing control, even knowing that, you trust that we won't hurt you. It wasn't phrased as a question, but I nodded anyway, because the impossible, bewildering thing was that I did. That somewhere between the first moment my suppressants started failing and this moment, lying in a bed with a first wave heat still running through my body, I'd learned to trust 4 alphas I barely knew with something I'd spent my entire adult life being terrified to give anyone. You came into that carpool because Dante told you I was joining, I said quietly. You wanted to know me before you decided whether you wanted me, and then when my suppressants failed and you could have treated my heat like permission to do whatever you wanted, you checked. You asked. You've been asking for everything. That's why I trust you. That's why I trust all of you. His hand shook when he reached for me. The moment felt weighted with implications that neither of us was quite ready to articulate, but the kiss was gentle. And it was promise, and it was restraint, and it was a reminder that there were things worth waiting for. By the evening of day 2, I was becoming familiar with the cycle. Waves of intense need that crested and broke, followed by periods of relative calm where I could actually think clearly. During the calm moments, Rowan would tell me stories about how he'd come to live with 3 other alphas in a compound designed for privacy, how they'd built something that worked because they'd learned to function as a unit rather than competing individuals. How they'd looked at Omega companionship as something that required structure and intention rather than just biological compatibility. During the waves, Yasuo would hold me through the intensity of it. His hands would find my hair, my face, my arms, grounding me with touch that was affectionate and charged but never crossed the line into explicit. The hardest part seemed to be that he wanted to, that his entire body was screaming to take things further, but that he'd chosen restraint because he'd learned that the heat would run its course faster and more manageable if we let it. Dante appeared in the evening with fresh water and food, and the kind of practical care that suggested he'd appointed himself logistics handler. Kenji stayed nearby throughout the waves, his presence alone enough to calm something in my nervous system, his voice capable of talking me through the intense moments with a gentleness that felt like magic. On the 3rd day, my heat reached a different phase. The fever broke completely. The waves of intense need became less frantic and more focused. My body was exhausted but no longer fighting itself, and I began to understand what the 2nd phase of heat was actually about. Not the peak intensity that I'd been warned about, but the deeper need that existed beneath the surface, the need for connection that went beyond the physical response that had driven me to the bed in the first place. "Do you want to try?" Kenji asked quietly, when I was lying in one of the calm moments on the afternoon of day 3. The calm moments where I could think with something approaching clarity. I knew what he was asking. "Do you want to escalate? Do you want to find out what happens when 4 alphas finally let restraint collapse in the presence of an Omega who's asked for them?" And my answer came immediately. Yes, not because my heat was driving me, but because I wanted to understand what it meant to let go completely. What it meant to not be afraid of 4 men who'd proven themselves trustworthy. What it meant to stop running from the Omega part of me that wanted this. Yasuo, Rowan, and Dante appeared within minutes, which told me that they'd all been hovering in the hallway waiting for permission. And when Kenji closed the door and locked it, I understood that the careful, restrained version of heat management was about to give way to something more intense. Not necessarily more explicit in the way that I'd feared during my most anxious moments, but more honest, more real. More about 4 alphas finally letting themselves respond to the Omega in their bed who'd asked for everything they had to give. Yasuo came first. His hand found my face with a gentleness that didn't match the intensity in his eyes. "You're sure?" he asked one more time, which told me that even now, even with his restraint cracking at the seams, he was still checking, still making space for me to change my mind. I kissed him instead of answering, and felt the exact moment that his control finally, completely broke. His hands were in my hair, his mouth was consuming, and the sound he made against my lips was the sound of a man who'd been holding on by his fingernails and had finally let go. Rowan was suddenly there, pressing against my back, his large hands settling on my waist with a tenderness that felt undeserved given the size of him and the intensity of the need I could feel radiating off him. Dante appeared with water, pressing it into my hand, because even in the depths of heat response, he remembered that hydration mattered more than anything else. And Kenji stayed close, his voice a constant through the intensity, reminding me to breathe, reminding me that I was safe, reminding me that 4 alphas could want me this much and still treat me with care. The final phase of heat lasted exactly as long as it needed to. By the time it broke completely, on the evening of the 3rd day, I was wrapped in blankets and surrounded by 4 alphas who had no plans to move anytime soon. The compound had become my world. The bed had become my center. And these 4 men had become the explanation for the entire impossible trajectory of the last 72 hours. "What happens now?" I asked quietly, into the comfortable silence that comes after crisis passes. "We call your work and tell them you're sick," Dante said. "Then you stay here while we figure out what this is and what you want it to be. No pressure. No expectations. Just time to understand each other when biology isn't screaming at us. Tomorrow," Kenji said softly, "we can start over. Properly. With introductions and conversations and the kind of getting to know each other that should have happened before the carpool but that heat didn't exactly make time for." Rowan was already asleep, his massive frame taking up half the bed, his presence a constant weight that my body had learned to find comforting. And Yasuo was watching me with an intensity that suggested he was cataloging every expression on my face, every moment of vulnerability, every sign that I might regret anything that had happened over the past 3 days. "I don't regret anything," I said quietly, preemptively. "I know this is complicated. I know we're going to have to figure out what a relationship looks like when it starts with a heat cycle and 4 alphas and me barely knowing you, but I don't regret asking to stay. I don't regret trusting you. I don't regret any of it." Yasuo's hand found mine in the darkness. His thumb traced gentle circles on my wrist, over the pulse point where my Omega biology sang in recognition of his alpha presence. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "I'm going to tell you the rest. About why Dante recruited you. About why I volunteered for the carpool. About why Rowan and Kenji agreed to let 4 become 5. About all the ways we've been waiting for you since before you even knew we existed. But tonight, I just want to sit with the fact that you're here, that you stayed, that you trusted us. And I will," I whispered back. "I'll stay. I'll trust. I'll let tomorrow come and I'll listen to whatever story you've been building, and I'll understand that this started long before my suppressants failed. That 4 alphas had already decided I was worth the careful, intricate work of earning my trust before they ever put me in a carpool." Outside, Seattle rain began to fall, and I lay in the center of 4 alphas and understood finally why my suppressants had failed. It wasn't about the medication. It was about biology recognizing what my mind hadn't yet learned, that I'd finally found the place where I was supposed to be, where invisible omegas became seen, where careful, controlled lives gave way to something messier and more real, where four alphas had decided that one omega was worth planning for, worth waiting for, worth building an entire infrastructure around. The rain continued, and the night deepened, and I slipped toward sleep surrounded by the scent of four alphas who had already decided I belonged to them. And for the first time since I realized what I was, I didn't fight it. I was home. The morning after my heat broke felt like waking up in someone else's life. The kind of morning where nothing quite lined up with what I remembered, where the trajectory of the previous 72 hours had fundamentally reorganized every assumption I'd made about who I was supposed to be. I woke in a bed that smelled like four alphas and one very confused omega. Rowan was sprawled across most of the mattress, his arm somehow still curved protectively around my waist despite the fact that his heat-driven urgency had given way to something gentler. Yasuo was asleep in the chair beside the bed, which told me he'd positioned himself there deliberately, like he couldn't quite convince himself to leave even after everything that had happened. Kenji and Dante had retreated to the hallway at some point, presumably to give me space to wake up without a full audience, which was thoughtful in a way that made me understand these four men had been thinking about Omega needs long before I actually became their Omega. I moved carefully, trying not to wake Rowan, and managed to swing my legs out of the bed without disturbing anyone. My body felt different, lighter, like the weight I'd been carrying for 6 years of suppressants and invisibility had been set down and I'd forgotten what it felt like to not be holding it. The walk to the bathroom was unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with physical weakness and everything to do with the reality that I was now deeply, irrevocably connected to four alphas who lived in a compound designed for exactly this scenario. The bathroom was attached to what I was quickly understanding was the alphas' shared bedroom, which meant there was nowhere in this space that was truly separate from them. The shower was massive, clearly designed for multiple bodies, and I stood under the hot water and tried to process the impossible. 3 days ago I was invisible. 3 days ago I had a job I went to and an apartment I paid rent for and a life that was small and controlled and safe. 3 days ago I had never been touched by an alpha in any way that mattered, and my heat had never been managed by anyone but myself and the suppressants I'd doubled up on out of desperation and anxiety. Now I was in an alpha compound, wearing someone's shirt because my clothes had been sacrificed to the cause of heat management, and trying to figure out how to exist in a body that had made decisions my mind wasn't entirely certain it endorsed. The knock on the bathroom door came at exactly the moment I was working through the existential panic. Kenji's voice, gentle through the wood. "Just checking you're okay." I called back, which was probably a lie, but was also the kind of thing you said when you didn't want to worry the alphas who'd spent 72 hours making sure you were safe. He waited, long enough for me to understand that he knew I was lying. But he didn't push, just left water and fresh clothes outside the door and retreated, giving me the privacy that I apparently didn't deserve but was getting anyway, because four alphas had apparently decided that consent extended to the small moments too. Dressed in clothes that fit me because apparently someone had sized them correctly while I was sleeping, I made my way back to the bedroom. Rowan had woken up and was sitting on the edge of the bed looking rumpled and far less intimidating than he looked at the office. Yasuo was still asleep in the chair, and when I appeared, Rowan stood carefully, like he was trying not to startle me. "How are you feeling?" His voice was gentle, like someone had turned my entire life upside down in exactly the right way, I said, which was honest. His expression shifted into something complicated. "That's one way to describe it. There's coffee. And breakfast. We thought you might want actual food instead of the nutrient paste Kenji kept trying to feed you yesterday." I managed to smile because it felt true that Kenji would try to optimize nutrition during a heat emergency. Yasuo woke the moment I moved toward him, which told me his sleep had been the kind of alpha sleep, light and ready. His hand found my wrist before I'd even fully registered he was awake. His thumb traced the pulse point with the kind of gentleness that made my body remind me of everything that had happened in this room. "You're okay." Not a question. He needed the confirmation anyway. Downstairs was a kitchen that had clearly been designed by people who understood that four alphas eating together required significant surface area. The table was loaded with the kind of food that suggested someone had gone through a serious meal preparation process. Eggs, rice, vegetables that had been cooked in ways that made them smell like home. Dante was standing at the stove with a spatula, playing the role of chef with a focus that suggested this was a regular position in the 4-alpha household. Kenji was sitting at the table with his laptop open, and he looked up when I entered with an expression that was half satisfaction and half something more complex. "You stayed," he said quietly. We all thought you might wake up and realize what you'd gotten yourself into and bolt. But you stayed. I stayed, I confirmed, sitting down because my legs were still getting used to supporting my weight. The heat was real, but this is real too. I'm choosing to stay. The relief that washed across his face suggested this had been a genuine concern, that 4 alphas had spent the heat cycle wondering if I'd wake up in the clear light of morning and regret the entire trajectory. Breakfast happened in stages. Dante maintained the cooking operations. Rowan sat across from me and managed the conversation with the kind of ease that suggested he was comfortable with silences as long as they had a purpose. Kenji worked on his laptop while maintaining the thread of attention that kept everything moving, and Yasuo sat next to me with his hand on the back of my chair, not touching me but maintaining proximity that felt necessary to both of us. Somewhere around the middle of the eggs, Kenji closed his laptop. "I need to tell you the story," he said simply, "about why this all happened. Why the carpool? Why the compound? Why 4 alphas agreed to what amounts to a pretty elaborate plan to put you in close proximity until your suppressants failed." I set down my coffee. "I'm ready," I said, which wasn't entirely true because I wasn't sure I was ready for anything at this point, but I was also curious enough that the anxiety felt secondary. "Dante was the first one to figure it out," Kenji started. "He was in the marketing department doing quarterly reports, and he noticed something about your work that made him start watching how you moved through the office. The precision. The way you made yourself smaller. The suppressants that Dante could smell from across the room, even though they were supposed to be industrial grade. He knew you were Omega, and he knew you were struggling. Why would he care?" I asked, because I genuinely didn't understand the impulse. "Because," Kenji said quietly, "Dante's younger sister is Omega, and she spent 10 years invisible before she found alphas worth trusting. She's happy now. She has everything she needs. And Dante looks at every struggling Omega in a 50-mile radius and sees his sister at 16, terrified and alone, and making herself smaller so nobody would notice what she was. So he started paying attention to you, started leaving you notes about the company newsletter, started finding reasons to be in the break room when you were making tea that nobody asked for, and eventually, he decided that you needed an intervention. That's when he brought it to us." Rowan had come to the compound through a different route. He'd been military, alpha security, built to protect things. And when Dante described an Omega who was practically invisible, who was doubling up on suppressants out of anxiety, who was clearly suffering under the weight of trying to exist safely in a world that wasn't built for people like us, Rowan had understood something fundamental. That invisible Omegas were usually invisible because they'd learned that visibility was dangerous. That the only way he could help would be to show you that visibility could be safe. That an alpha could see you completely and still choose to be gentle. Yasuo's part of the story was the part that made me understand the real motivation. Dante had described a marketing Omega with an unusual mind. Someone who translated languages, who understood nuance, who moved through the office with a precision that suggested they'd learned to exist in very specific ways. Yasuo was a strategist. He understood patterns, and he understood immediately that the pattern he was seeing was someone who'd learned to be invisible on purpose. When Dante suggested that this Omega might need something more than just rescue, Yasuo had immediately volunteered to be the bait. The one whose scent would trigger my suppressants. The one whose presence would activate whatever dormant biology had been waiting under the chemical layers. Because, and this was the part that made my chest tight, Yasuo had read my work, my translations, the margins of precision and care that suggested I cared deeply about getting things exactly right, and he'd decided that someone who cared that much about precision was worth the risk of planning an elaborate scheme to get me to the compound. Kenji's role had been research and medical. He dug into what I needed to know about Omega biology, about heats, about the fact that first heats were often the most intense because they represented the biological recognition of someone compatible, and when Dante had asked him to join, Kenji had immediately started building a protocol for heat management that prioritized comfort and consent, and the kind of careful attention that suggested he'd thought deeply about how to handle another person's biological crisis without making it traumatic. "So you foreplanned this," I said slowly, understanding finally the full scope of what had happened. "You planned to get me in the carpool. You planned to wait until my suppressants failed. You planned to take me to this compound. You planned to manage my heat in a way that was about care instead of exploitation. And you did all of this without my consent or knowledge of what was happening." The sentence came out as a statement, not a question. but it hung in the air with implications that were heavy enough to require response. "We did," Kenji said quietly, "and I understand if you're angry about that. I understand if you feel like your autonomy was violated. But I need you to understand why we did it. Because invisible Omegas don't usually get the choice about their first heat. They suffer through it alone, or they accept the first alpha who shows interest, or they find themselves in situations where consent becomes a luxury they can't afford. We wanted you to have a choice. We wanted your first heat to be managed by people who cared about your well-being. We wanted you to wake up on the other side of it and have the option to stay or leave, fully informed. And we've been prepared for the possibility that you choose to leave. But you're not leaving," Yasuo said quietly. His hand had found my shoulder at some point during the explanation, and his thumb was tracing gentle patterns against the fabric of the shirt I was wearing. "You had the night to think about it, and you're still here, and you're still looking at us like you're trying to figure out if you can trust what we've done, which is the right response, which is the response we've been hoping for. I need time," I said slowly, "to process this, to understand it. Because on one level, I understand that you violated my autonomy in a way that would be unforgivable if you hadn't managed it so carefully that I only felt supported. But on another level, I understand that 4 alphas saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself, and they built an infrastructure to make sure I wouldn't have to suffer through what most Omegas suffer through. I don't know how to feel about that yet." "Then you'll figure it out with us," Kenji said. "Take the time. We have it. This isn't a situation where you're on a clock. This isn't a heat-driven arrangement that ends when your biology settles. We're talking about building something that works for all of us, and that requires honesty and time and the willingness to sit with uncomfortable feelings. So we'll sit with them, together." The next few weeks became about re-establishing what it meant to exist as one Omega in a compound with 4 alphas who had apparently decided I was worth the elaborate planning they'd already invested. My job called 3 times asking where I was. The first call, I was sick. The second call, I was taking personal leave. The third call, I turned in a resignation letter that Dante helped me craft, because working in an office full of alphas now felt like a choice I'd only made when I didn't have better options. The compound became my new geography. 4 alphas showed me the rooms they inhabited, the kitchen where Dante maintained control, the study where Yasuo worked on strategy, the gym where Rowan trained, the library where Kenji spent his time when he wasn't working on projects that suggested he was involved in something more complicated than he'd initially implied, and the bedroom that smelled like all 4 of them, which had become my room too. Yasuo took the role of my primary confidant, which I understood was as deliberate as everything else about this arrangement. He would find me in the library where I'd retreated to understand my heat, and he would sit quietly until I was ready to talk. He taught me that alphas could exist in space with Omegas without needing to fill every silence with something. That patience could be a form of communication. That being seen didn't mean being consumed. Rowan taught me that physical space could be reassuring without being intrusive. He would train in the gym and know when I needed to be nearby, and he would make sure that was an option without ever explicitly offering. Dante taught me that Omega well-being required the kind of attention to detail that could make someone neurotic if they let it, but that could also make someone feel genuinely cared for if they understood the impulse behind it. He cooked breakfast like it was a prayer. He checked on my hydration like it was personally important to him. He read my suppressant prescriptions the way I read translations, looking for nuance and understanding in the clinical language. Kenji taught me that alpha intellect could be oriented toward understanding rather than domination, that asking questions didn't diminish his authority, that an alpha could be curious about how an Omega experienced the world without needing that Omega to conform to what the alpha expected. The physical relationship evolved slowly. There were no more heat cycles yet, and apparently they weren't in any rush. Yasuo would kiss me in the morning and it would feel like a promise. Rowan would pull me close in the evening and it would feel like security. Dante would brush his hand against mine in the kitchen and it would feel like attention. Kenji would find me in the library and it would feel like being understood. But nothing escalated beyond what we'd already experienced. No one suggested it should. No one pushed. The compound had enough space that we could be close without being suffocating, and the alphas had enough discipline to understand that rebuilding an Omega's sense of safety required moving slowly. 2 months into living at the compound, I stopped thinking about the office, stopped thinking about the apartment I'd given up, stopped thinking about the life I'd been living, and started understanding that what I'd been doing was existing, not living. The difference was subtle but real. Existing was putting one foot in front of the other while trying not to be noticed. Living was Kenji asking me to help him translate something because he'd realized I understood nuance better than any translation software he could access. Living was Dante, creating an entire menu around foods I mentioned liking in passing. Living was Yasuo, sitting with me during a moment of panic about whether I was making the right choices, not trying to fix it, just letting me process. Living was Rowan, showing up when I needed physical grounding, understanding my body sometimes needed alpha presence the way other bodies needed water. The conversation about staying came 3 months in, and it came from me instead of them. We were sitting in the library, and Yasuo was reading something on his laptop while I translated an article that someone had paid Dante to get translated quickly. The work had become part of the arrangement, part of how I earned space in the compound, and it felt different from the marketing job. It felt like something I'd chosen, instead of something I'd been backed into. How much of this was planned? I asked suddenly, not looking up from the article. How much of you liking me is real versus how much of it is the plan that you've all been executing? Yasuo closed his laptop. His eyes found mine with the directness that I'd learned meant he was about to tell me something true. The plan was real. The purpose was real. The desire to keep you safe was real. But Aiden, I wasn't supposed to feel this much for you. I was supposed to be the trigger for your heat, and then we were supposed to let you decide if you wanted to stay. But somewhere between the morning I realized you were joining the carpool, and the moment your suppressants failed in the car, I fell in love with you. The real kind. The kind that isn't about biology or planning or strategy. The kind that makes me want to spend the rest of my life understanding how your mind works. I closed the translation, looked at him directly. So what you're telling me is that I'm not just a project. That 4 alphas didn't plan the most elaborate scheme just to rescue an invisible Omega, but also because you wanted me specifically. Because you were willing to risk this entire arrangement falling apart if I woke up and decided I wanted nothing to do with any of you. All 4 of us, Yasuo said quietly. Not just me. Kenji has been reading everything he can find about sustainable alpha-omega bonds, specifically because he wants to understand how to make this work long-term. Rowan has been checking in with his military contacts about security because he takes the responsibility of having you here seriously. Dante hasn't stopped researching Omega nutrition because he wants to make sure everything he feeds you is supporting your health. And I've been thinking about this situation every single moment since you walked into the carpool. All 4 of us. We want you. Not because the plan required it, because you're worth wanting. The words should have terrified me. Instead, they felt like permission. Permission to stop assuming I was a burden on these 4 alphas. Permission to understand that being wanted by 4 people who had proven themselves thoughtful enough to plan my safety might not be exploitation. Permission to believe that I could be loved by alphas without losing myself in the process. I want to stay, I said simply. I want to be here. I want to keep building this with all of you. I want to see what happens when 4 alphas and 1 omega decide to stop functioning separately and start functioning as a unit. Yasuo's smile was staggering. And we want to see it too. The next phase of the compound life was about integration. My things were moved from the room I'd been given to the shared bedroom where all 4 of them slept. My work became more permanent, more integrated into the household. I started learning how to navigate the rhythm of 4 alphas, with their own schedules and needs. Rowan would leave early for his security consulting work. Dante would manage the household and his various projects. Kenji would disappear into his study for hours, working on what I was slowly beginning to understand was something far more complex than the marketing position he publicly occupied. Yasuo would split his time between the strategy work he did for various organizations and the time he spent with me, and I understood that prioritizing my presence was a deliberate choice he was making daily. The second heat came exactly 1 month after the first one broke. This time I saw it coming. My body was different now, unmedicated, and I could feel the approaching wave like a storm on the horizon. Instead of fear, I felt anticipation. Instead of shame, I felt welcome. The heat hit just as we were waking, and instead of it being an emergency, it was an event that 4 alphas moved through with the kind of practiced ease that came from having prepared. The touches escalated faster this time. The restraint was still present, but it felt like choice rather than necessity. And I learned what it meant to let 4 alphas care for me without the fog of biological crisis making everything feel separate from my actual preferences. This time, the bed was something we navigated together. Yasuo's mouth found places that made my breath catch. Rowan's hands held me steady when the pleasure got too intense. Dante appeared with water and food at exactly the moments when my body needed sustenance. Kenji's voice guided me through the waves, naming what was happening in a way that made it feel safe instead of overwhelming. But nothing escalated beyond where it had been. The intimacy stayed at the level of connection, not conquest. And when the heat broke after 3 days, I understood that these 4 alphas had learned something crucial in the intervening month, that I was most satisfied when I felt seen, not overwhelmed, when I felt respected, not possessed, when the attention to my needs came from genuine concern rather than biological imperative. 6 months after I'd gotten into that Tesla in a parking garage, Yasuo took me on a walk through the property around the compound. The forest that surrounded the space was deeper than I'd realized, and it felt like stepping outside of time. He held my hand the way he had at the beginning, when he was still being careful about whether I wanted his touch. Now it felt like reflex, like the baseline of how we moved through the world. "We're thinking about formalizing this," he said quietly. "But some kind of commitment, some way of making it official that you're building a life here, and we're building a life with you. How do you feel about that?" I stopped walking, looked at him. "You have to understand what you're asking. You're asking me to commit to all 4 of you, to build something that defies every conventional relationship structure, to be Omega to 4 alphas who have to learn to coexist as my partners instead of competing. That's not simple. That's not easy. That's not what most Omegas would choose." Yasuo's expression shifted. "I know, but you're not most Omegas, and we're not most alphas. So maybe simple and easy aren't the priorities. Maybe building something real is." The ceremony happened on the first day of autumn, in the forest surrounding the compound. Just the 5 of us, because this wasn't about making a public declaration. It was about making a private one. Kenji spoke first, his words carefully chosen, his mind clearly organized around what commitment meant. "I'm choosing to be present for you, Aiden. To support your growth. To challenge you when you need it and hold you when you fall. To be one of the people you can trust completely." Rowan's words were simpler. "You're ours. We're yours. That's what this means." Dante spoke about nutrition and care and the 1,000 small ways that love manifested in the daily work of maintaining a household. And Yasuo spoke about seeing, about recognizing something in a person and deciding it was worth the enormous effort of building a life around, about choosing, daily, to not take the visible parts of me for granted. The ceremony didn't involve rings or bonding marks, though Kenji mentioned those might come later. It involved 4 alphas and 1 omega standing in a forest and agreeing that the carpool that had started as logistics had become the most important thing in all 5 of their lives. By the time winter arrived, I barely remembered the woman who'd gotten into that Tesla 6 months ago, the woman who'd been invisible, the woman who'd doubled up on suppressants out of anxiety, the woman who'd made herself small enough that nobody noticed she was suffering. That woman was still part of me, still carried the lessons of survival, but she wasn't the only thing anymore. There was also Aiden, who belonged to 4 alphas. Aiden, who translated important things into languages that mattered. Aiden, who was seen completely and didn't disappear under the weight of that seeing. Aiden, who had learned that being wanted by 4 people was possible and survivable and actually the most stabilizing thing that had ever happened to her. The conversation about the future came in the kitchen one morning, surrounded by the smell of breakfast and the comfortable presence of 4 alphas who had become the baseline of my existence. Dante was cooking. Rowan was reading the news on his tablet. Kenji was working on something that involved complex mathematics and his frustration at his laptop. Yasuo was sitting next to me with his hand on my knee, and I was reading something that didn't matter as much as the feeling of being in a space where I completely belonged. "Are you happy?" Kenji asked suddenly, not looking up from his laptop. The question was so direct it required honesty. "I am. I'm happier than I've ever been. There are things I'm still processing about how this started. There are moments where I think about the manipulation involved, even if it came from a place of genuine care, but I can't argue with the results. I'm visible now. I'm loved. I'm building something real with 4 people who decided that invisibility was a crime worth preventing." "What if we talked about the future?" Yasuo said quietly. "What if we talked about building something that extends beyond just the compound? There are Omega communities that are starting to understand what we're trying to do here. Alpha communities that recognize that 1 Omega with 4 alphas isn't a violation if everyone involved is committed and consenting. What if we documented this? We were talking about making it public, just in terms of saying that this kind of bond structure is possible." I understood what he was suggesting. That 5 people who'd found something that worked could become a model for other arrangements. That visibility could extend beyond just the personal to the structural. That an Omega who'd spent 6 years invisible could become, in some small way, visible to others who were still struggling. The idea terrified me and thrilled me in equal measure. I'd have to tell my story, Aiden said slowly. I'd have to be completely public about being Omega, about the suppressants, about the heat that started everything. You'd have to let people see all of it. I'd have to let people judge whether 4 alphas and 1 omega constituted a healthy relationship or a cult structure designed to trap vulnerable omegas. Are you ready for that scrutiny? Kenji asked, and his eyes were gentle. Because we are. We've all made peace with being examined and found either exemplary or terrible depending on who's doing the looking. But you shouldn't have to if you're not ready. The silence stretched. Outside, Seattle rain began to fall in the way that made winter feel like something that was happening to the world, whether people wanted it to or not. I'm ready, I said finally. I'm ready to be visible. I'm ready to be seen. I'm ready to tell the story of an Omega who got in a car with 4 alphas and changed everything about her life. Because maybe someone else who's invisible, who's doubled up on suppressants, who's made themselves so small they barely exist, maybe that person needs to know that there are alphas out there who are willing to plan your safety before they ever ask for anything in return. Maybe that person needs to know that being wanted doesn't have to mean being consumed. That 4 alphas and 1 omega can build something that works. Yasuo's hand tightened on my knee. Dante turned from the stove with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Rowan looked up from his tablet with something that might have been approval. And Kenji's fingers flew across his laptop keyboard like he was already starting to document the decision. By spring, we were public. By summer, there were other omegas visiting the compound. By fall, there were other alphas asking how to approach omega relationships with genuine care instead of just biological appetite. And by the time 2 years had passed since that first morning in the carpool, the compound had become something more than just a household. It had become a space where people came to learn what was possible when invisibility was finally completely rejected in favor of genuine connection. I still worked as a translator, but now I was translating things that mattered. Guides about omega safety, articles about sustainable alpha-omega bond structures, testimonials from omegas who'd found their way to what we were building. And with every translation, with every word I chose to carry the complexity of what I'd experienced, I understood more deeply that my invisibility had ended for a reason, not because 4 alphas had decided to rescue me, but because I'd been waiting all along for people who were willing to see me completely and then, having seen me, to ask if I wanted to stay. The carpool that had started as logistics had become the foundation of everything. The suppressants I'd doubled up on out of panic had given way to a body that functioned naturally, without chemical interference, secure in the knowledge that being seen wouldn't destroy me. The invisibility I'd cultivated for 6 years had dissolved into something that felt like freedom. I was visible. I was loved. I was building something real with 4 alphas who had learned, as I had, that the best relationships weren't about conquest or possession. They were about 4 people deciding, every single day, that 1 omega was worth the effort of seeing completely, worth the effort of knowing deeply, worth the infrastructure of care that they'd built before I even knew I needed it. The rain continued to fall on Seattle, and in the compound surrounded by forest, 5 people moved through the rhythms of a life that had started with a carpool and escalated into something that rewrote every rule about how love could be structured. We were not traditional. We were not simple. We were not what most people would choose, but we were real. We were visible. We were exactly what happens when 4 alphas and 1 omega decide that the person they found is worth building an empire around. And in the end, that was everything.